It's an honor to be here, and I want to thank President Hertzberger for inviting us and everyone that we've done. I want to thank my colleagues, Monica and Angela. Where's Angela? There she is right there, in putting all of this together. What you've just seen is a small trailer of a very important documentary that, in fact, is being shown tonight in downtown Los Angeles, and hopefully we're going to have an opportunity to show the entire documentary here at Whittier College, because it is an unbelievable situation. But we're here today because we're very proud that we're developing a leadership program for Latina women. We want to build on the leadership skills that women have and what they can offer, but we want to learn from each other, the kind of work that was done on the past. We all build on one another. So we want to have an opportunity to learn today from Antonia, not only about this case, we'll be talking about this case, but we really want to get into the depth and understand how this young woman took on a powerful organization, LA County, which represents over 10 million people. Today they have a budget of well over $37 billion, operate many programs, but at that time she was a young woman and she took on this case. So we're going to find out about Antonia and what was she about, what she was thinking, and probably things she hasn't even reflected on herself so many years ago. So let's start talking about this case. If you'd share with us, Antonia, tell us a little bit briefly about the Madrigal case. Many of these folks here do not know about it. If you can tell us a bit how old you were, what you were doing, and how it came about.
Well, the Madrigal case is a case involving the forced sterilization of, at that time, Mexican-American women at LA County USC Hospital. I was a newly minted lawyer, 25 years old, working at Model Cities, a legal services office on Brooklyn, now Cesar Chavez, and one of the few at that time Mexican-American lawyers working. And one day, this doctor walked in the door with a box full of medical files. And since I was the last lawyer hired, the bottom of the totem pole, they gave me the case of Bernie, Dr. Rosenthal, who, was on a mission, obsessed, in trying to let the public know what was going on at the county hospital.
So tell me, how did you decide to take on this case? I mean, here you were, they were telling you that there was forced sterilization going on at LA County. Did you believe it? Did you think that was true at the time? I mean, after all, this was, what, 1970?
1974. At first, I couldn't believe it. And the doctor was very persistent. I was a lawyer, not a doctor. I was given a box of lots of medical files. And most of you have experience with doctors. You can't understand their writing. I didn't have a medical background. And I started reading the files. And I slowly realized, oh my God, this is for real. Something's happening. And I had a colleague, Georgina Risk, who was an attorney who started with myself, and the rest of the office was male. So one of the first things I had to do was go and convince the upper hierarchy of the legal aid office that this was an important case and that I should be given the time to really look into it and to invest in it. At that time, I had a caseload of 100 clients, so I had a whole bunch of other stuff to do. And I am very stubborn and very persistent, and I don't take no for an answer. So I became the Bernie Rosenfeld of the office, saying, let me do it, let me do it, let me do it, I will do it. And so they allowed me to do it. And what's interesting to me is, I had medical files with addresses of women, and this was hundreds of women, not just a few. And I had to drive around El Sereno, Highland Park, East LA, Boyle Heights, and different parts of LA County, knocking on strangers' doors, trying to locate the women. And when I did, asking them to let me into their home to tell them that they had been sterilized. They did not know. Many of them, it was like, and then the other thing too was, in the Mexican American community, there's this myth que te amarran los tubos y que después te los pueden desamarrar. No, and you know that that's not the case medically. And so those, when I said your tubes have been tied, they would say, pero me los pueden desamarrar. And I had to tell them no. So, and I did that. I drove trying to locate these women for about 6-7 months, up and down. And then the next challenge was saying, now that you know that you've been sterilized, would you consent to being involved in a lawsuit? These are poor, with low levels of education, Mexicanas. Most of them didn't speak English. And it took a heck of a lot of courage on these women. Eventually, we filed on behalf of 11 women. And those 11 women were not the only women. Those are the women that we could capture within a period of time that still allowed us to go into federal court. This case was filed in the federal district court here in LA.
But Antonia, at that time you were a young woman. You were how old?
26.
Oh, a 26-year-old. So had you taken on any other big cases at that time?
Actually, a little bit, yes. It doesn't exist today, but Legal Aid Model Cities was a program funded by HUD to the city of LA, and at that time, we could take any litigation that we wanted to. And I had worked for Malta as a clerk my first to second year of being
Malta is the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education.
Yes. And they did impact litigation, so I was familiar with it already, the concept of impact litigation. And then my second to third year, I had worked in Santa Maria with the farm workers on behalf of the farm workers. And at that time, Cesar Chavez and the struggle for unionization. So I was been familiar with the concept of impact litigation. And in model cities, they allowed me to take on criminal cases in the defense of kids who had been beaten up by the cops and charged with police abuse. And now it's called 242, I think it's still, whatever it is. And so I did some of that. And then I did some smaller litigation on Social Security, impact litigation, as people that were being denied, but nothing of this magnitude. And I didn't realize.
You went to law school, I mean, you went on, you could have been a big lawyer, got a Century law firm, or what is it, Century City Law Firm, and made a whole lot of money. What made you decide to go into the kind of law and the kind of litigation that you were pursuing?
I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States when I was 8. I did migrant work in the fields, all up and down San Joaquin Valley. I grew up in the Maravilla projects. I actually went to school to be a teacher, because at that time, for you young Latina women, if you went to college, you were either secretary, a teacher, or a nurse. There weren't very many options open. So I have my credentials, to be a teacher. But I decided on the law because I was interested in change, in improving the quality of life for the Mexican American community and in my neighborhood.
So you were interested in the issues of social justice as compared to fighting for a corporate lawyer or doing that kind of work?
Never, ever wanted. There's nothing wrong with working in a corporate sector. There's nothing wrong with being a partner in a firm. There's nothing wrong with being whatever. But I went to law school for one reason, and that was to be a do-gooder, a public interest lawyer.
This advocate itself, you seem very defined that as a young woman that this is what you wanted to do. You were going to go out and seek those issues, social justice issues. You were going to pursue them. and you were going to have the law work on behalf of the community. That was going to be your goal.
Totally.
And so here you are as a young lawyer taking on big, big county. I mean, they have all the money in the world. They're going to hire the top Century City law firms, as you know, bring in all of these people and belittle your case that is going to be tough. What were you feeling at that time? I mean, you were taking on this huge giant.
Well, and this is one of the lessons that I want to pass on to the younger generation. No tengan miedo. Don't be afraid. Take risks. And when you're young, I had no idea of the magnitude of the case and the impact and how difficult it was going to be. Sometimes it's better not to know how difficult things are going to be. I mean, it's the truth. So what was I thinking? It was just one step at a time, one step in front of me. But one of the things that, is I told some people, I got very angry when I realized that this could happen to my mother. My younger sister, Lisa, had been born at LA County, USC in 1968, which was that period of time when they were, this practice was going on. And when I realized that they could have done this to my mommy, then, it was a clear picture for me. They're not going to do it to other women. I didn't know how. I had no idea of, like I said, how hard it was going to be. But, that's another lesson. And, they don't write it in books. Most people that make change is because of the fire in the belly. That passion, that sense of right and wrong. And the rest comes into play, but that's what you do. And I don't know of very many people in leadership positions that sit and think, oh my God, I'm going to be a leader. It doesn't happen that way. You're just dealt with certain cards and you deal with them. And, if it hadn't been for me and Georgie, my other woman colleague, this case would have not been filed. And that's the other thing, the importance of being within the system. I demonstrated, I picketed, I took over the chancellor's office, I did all of that stuff. But I chose the law because I wanted to change within the system. And I understood that the law was a vehicle of changing within the system, using the system's rules and laws.
So now we know that you had the passion.
Yeah.
The fire in the belly, as you say, that is what you were doing. You knew this was an injustice. It could have happened to your family. It was happening to women every single day. Hard to believe that in the late 60s, early 70s, they were forcibly sterilizing, something that you couldn't believe was going on. And you had no fear, because you were young and you didn't know fear, is what you're telling us. But how did you strategize for this case? How did you start putting it together? I mean, this is not a simple thing either. You had to start figuring out, besides contacting the women, trying to get your plaintiffs together, putting together the case. How did you take on? I mean, you had no experience in putting together a case before the federal courts. Share with us that.
It was an interesting group of three of us, okay? Georgina Risk, and we went to law school together, and Charlie Navarrete. And Charlie Navarrete had 2 years ahead of us, and is blind, okay? So two inexperienced young Latinas, and one with 2 years experience who's blind. But you know what? One, we all knew what we didn't know, and we knew that we could use the law. And yes, we sat down at tables and strategized. For the women who had been sterilized recently and still could sue the county, for compensation, we gave it to private lawyers. There were many women who had no remedy because the statute of limitation had run. But there was a group of women, many of them the plaintiffs, where we could sue. And then the question of strategy was, okay, under the court, at that time, civil rights laws, do we sue in federal court, do we sue in state court? We would consult, I would call professors, you know, they were still my friends in law school, and I said, can I do this? And they would say, well, Antonia, what are you trying to do? We would read, I bought a medical book, okay, I mean, literally, bought a medical book, and, you know, when we were reading the files and it said, blah, 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 I said, okay, what does this mean, you know? And then nobody in LA or California that was a doctor would talk to us. Nobody, because of the code of silence. So we had to go to New York to begin talking to OBGYNs, gynecologists, and asking them questions. So we did the research. One of the things about the law is that lawyers aren't so much about substance. We're taught to connect the dots, to think, because what do people come to lawyers for? To solve problems. And the good lawyers are able to connect the dots to solve a problem. That's the skill that we learn. So to me, it was connecting the dots. In fact, you know, the story of how I got to know Miss Molina. Well, that was one of the dots I had to connect. So we're ready to file. You know, we have all of our plaintiffs. They finally agreed that they were going to do it. And then we wanted to file a class action. And we go, oh my God, we don't have a class plaintiff. Because to file a class action, you have to find an organization that represents the class of women that you're representing. And so somebody says to me, and I'm going, oh my God, where am I going to get one? And so somebody says, well, there's a new organization called Comisión Femenil. Well, guess who was the president of Comisión Femenil? Miss Gloria Molina, and doing things, you know, because the belly, you know, the fire in the belly. They would happen to be meeting. I pushed myself into the agenda, and I told them, would you be class plaintiffs, even though if we lose, you might be, you know, monetarily liable, and I need an answer like 2 days. And they did.
Well, of course, for us, it was hard to believe that this was going on. After all, it was the 1970s. Who would think that at that time there would be forcible sterilization? And Antonia presented the case to us, and of course, all of us at that time agreed that we had to be a part of this class. And I had an opportunity to meet with many of the plaintiffs at that time. It was hard to believe these stories were going on, but they were very, very real stories. These were women who were going into the hospital to have their baby happily. And then all of a sudden, they're confronted with this situation. All of them had a C-section, they had to go for cesarean. So all of a sudden, tell us what happened at that point in time.
Well,
how did they get away with it?
You know, you have to think of the time and the era. And if you go back to the late 60s, the 70s, it was the eugenics, the population explosion. And then, of course, you know, the sentiment that's going on today, you know, the Mexicans blame the undocumented for everything. And all these undocumented are having babies, and as soon as they have babies, they're going to go on welfare, you know. And so it was that environment, and these women were going in to have a child. They had complications in their pregnancy, and they had to have a C-section. Some of them signed, because, you know, in pain you would sign just about anything. I had a C-section, so I know how painful it is, okay? And some of them didn't sign at all, and the signatures were like you could tell that they didn't know what the heck they were doing.
They were stressed.
Totally. I mean, we hired, you know, a writing expert who testified that those who signed had been under pain and duress. And so, you know, we got it all together, and we filed. And in retrospect, you know, people have asked me, because through this whole process, you talk about everything that happened. In retrospect, to think about, if I had to do it over again, file this lawsuit, I think that one judgment call that we made, that I would do differently, I felt that the case was so compelling that I would go before a judge and not a jury. Because you got to keep in mind, this is federal district court. Juries at that time were predominantly Anglo, and juries in federal court tend to be conservative, okay? Even today. So we thought we're going to take our chance with a judge. So we asked for a judge trial instead of a jury trial. So if I look back, that's one thing that I might have done a little differently, but we filed and we went to trial in 1976. It was almost a 3-week trial.
And of course, at that time, you had Dr. Rosenfeld, who was actually a doctor at
Yes.
LA County, USC. He had seen this practice, and he was, of course, one of the bold individuals who at that time felt this was an injustice. He said, this has to stop. He had gone through his chain of command, and they hadn't really respected or felt that there was any problem going on. They were kind of cavalier about what they were doing. But he stood firm, and he's still today very firm about what was going on at that time. And of course, in LA County, they, of course, would not admit that they had done any of these things at all. These women were frightened and intimidated. They were in pain. And all of a sudden, they were told, as the documentary shares with us, that many of these women were told that if you don't have this operation, your child's going to die. So they were intimidated in the most horrible way possible. So here you go to court. You have a very compelling case. You understand it very clearly, a total injustice. So now you're going to go before the judge and you're going to present this case. Tell us about what happened in those 3 weeks.
Well, first I'd like to say that Bernie, Rosenfeld, and all of the people who participated in this case, particularly the women, paid a heavy price for doing that. And that's one of the lessons I want to give to you, that there's a price to be paid for the decisions that you make. And Bernie suffered significantly for that. He was literally booted out of LA County. They threatened to take his medical license away. He ended up practicing in Detroit, and today he practices in Houston. So, and I can go on without names, but what happened in this case is for 3 weeks, we put up, I thought, a very good case. We brought in a doctor from New York to testify about the practice. We brought in a professor, an anthropologist, Carlos Velez, who at that time was a professor at UCLA, to testify about the cultural, impact that this would have on a woman. We had the writing expert. We had the women testify. And, and being at that court at that time, you could sense the feeling of empathy and connection with those people that were watching the trial. The women were so sincere. And I thought, we won. We presented, it's a factual case. We presented the case. And there were 2 reporters that covered this case every single day. Frank Cruz, who at that time was with NBC, Channel 4, and Geraldo Lopez, who at that time was a young reporter for La Opinión. And we all thought that we had won. And after the trial, a couple of weeks later, month, in fact, it was longer than weeks, I got a call that the judge had ruled. And we lost. And he ruled that it was the women's fault. And he used the testimony of the anthropologist. And it's in the written decision that it was their fault. He blamed it on the plaintiffs. And in a case like this, when you argue the facts, it's very hard to overturn on appeal because you rely on the fact finder, the judge, and it's very hard to overturn. So we lost the case. We lost the battle. That's
Now,
the other lesson.
let's talk about the losing the case. So here you are, you're going in, you thought it was a very compelling story and testimony and all that you had organized and strategized for the judge. You present it in a way that could be presented to a judge, and then you find out that you've lost the case. So how does Antonia Hernandez feel that day?
I was devastated. And in fact, like I said, I'm very stubborn, and very little gets to me. And I was just stunned. And I was about cry. And I remember Frank Cruz saying, don't you dare cry, the media's out there. You did a very good job. You stand out there, with dignity, and you move on. And, and I will tell you, it was so hard for me to explain to the women because, one of the things that, in assuming, being at the front, as I said, there's consequences. And to me, to this day, I feel I did an excellent job, the best job I could do considering the time and the place and my experience. So I don't have any regrets about that. My biggest regret is that I put these women through this horrible process. And I knew the terrible price they pay, and I felt I let them down. And to this day, I feel I let them down.
Well, Antonia, here you are, this young woman who's taken on Big County, a huge lawsuit. You presented it the best you could. You go into court, and you find out that you've lost. And you feel devastated even today.
Mm-hmm.
So do you just walk away? Do you just say, that's over, I lost, there's nothing I can do?
No.
Is that what Antonia done?
Are you
What did
kidding?
Antonia say? Share with us.
There's different ways to skin a cat. That's number one. And you only lose when you stop trying. It sounds cliche, but it's not. You determine the point in time in which you lose, because that's when you stop trying. And so for me, it was I lost the battle, but I'm not about to lose the war. And so with a lot of women, with Comisión Femenil and a movement, we went to the federal government in the state of California to impose regulations that to this day require a waiting period for women who want to be, sterilized, and that they cannot be approached for sterilization during labor. So at the end of the day, we lost for those women, but we won for the rest of the women to come. And so that was a victory.
So while you lost in court, at the end of the day, you changed the regulations, not just in this state, but across this country on the regulations. So now there is a 3-day waiting period, there is the bilingual counseling, there is information that is provided to them as to what a sterilization is, and there is informed consent. So you won the big war, but it wasn't that easy to win that war either. Tell us about some of the obstacles. I mean, the women's movement was going on. Women and feminists wanted abortion upon demand. They didn't seem to understand that these women were victimized by a system and needed some kind of justice. So tell us about that situation.
Well, it's interesting because one of a significant barrier to us getting the relief with HUD and the state and regulations was the women. But you also have to think in the context of what was going on at that time. The women's movement arose because it was an upper class group of women, okay? And, for decades, one could not claim that the women's movement represented working women of any ethnicity or race, okay? So the women were fighting for the freedom of choice. They had no understanding of how that freedom of choice impacted poor women. Because keep in mind, this was happening in the Carolinas. They were sterilizing black girls. This was happening in Appalachia. So it was a class issue as well as an ethnicity race issue. And so some of my biggest battles was battling the women, and many of them opposed what we were trying to do. So, and that's the other lesson that I would want to give to you. There are no permanent partners, and there are no permanent adversaries. And you cannot assume that everyone thinks like you or should think like you just because they're a woman. Your life experience comes into play. And that's why women of every gender, every class need to be at the table, because we all bring different lenses. We see the world differently, and we enrich the debate by bringing out perspective. And so I made alliances with the women who needed the protection. And, think of it from a perspective of a woman. After this and after that, I became the President General Counsel of Malta. And I fought for the right of choice. Choice to vote, choice where to go to school, where to live. Yes, I want people to have choice. But choice is informed choice, not just blind choice. And that's the difficult thing, even today, to really define what choice is and what rights we have, and whether our rights and our freedom tramples on other people's rights and freedoms.
As Antonia mentioned, I was the president of Comisión Femenil at the time, and we were strong feminists, Chicana feminists. We found ourselves certainly not connected with the larger feminist movement because as Latinas, we sort of didn't fit that profile exactly. And at the same time, we were part of the Chicano movement, but the Chicano movement at that time, which was fighting social injustice and discrimination, still regulated us to second class. And so we found ourselves at sort of an interesting time. But I remember that many of the women, when I would have these discussions with them at the time, were very upset that here we were threatening the possibility of women's right to choose. The fact that we were going to ask for a waiting period, that we were now going to ask for counseling, all of these were counterproductive to women's access to choice. We tried to, at that time, to let them know of this abuse and what was going on, and very frankly, they didn't care. It wasn't important to them. The larger issue was very important. They felt badly for these women, and were very sorry about what happened, but they didn't want it to happen. So winning these regulations, and originally I think Antonia wanted a 10-day waiting period or a 7-day waiting period. We ended up with a 3-day waiting period, informed consent, and it worked very well because the other part of it, we also did not want it to stop a woman's right to choose. But informed consent was critical. And so I think, Antonia, you have no regrets that you should have it all. Very frankly, if you look around the room, you may have saved the lives of many of the women here in this room by your actions. But we're here to talk about leadership. So this is leadership that she took on when she was a young woman in her mid-20s, just out of law school. You went on to do other kinds of things. Today, you head up a major multi-billion-dollar organization that deals with wealthy philanthropists from all over, giving and granting money and raising money to various things. You've headed up, you've been general counsel of the Mexican-American Legal Defense Education Fund. You are the judiciary lawyer for Senator Kennedy and his committee. You've been a leader on immigration issues. So all of this leadership role that you've had, tell us a little bit from that to this today. Do you think that with all that you've learned along the way, would you take on, if you were that lawyer today, at your age now, and Bernie Rosenfeld walked in with his box of medical files and so on, put it this, would you think you would file that case today?
You damn right I would.
So you're still fighting for social justice?
Oh, absolutely.
Are there enough of us doing it?
There's a place for all of us, and I'm very reluctant to accept this thing about a leader. I don't really see myself that way at all. I'm a do-gooder, and I'm passionate about equality and justice. And not just, I fight for Latinos, but for everyone. And so everything I've done, I mean, I see myself as very blessed to be in this country. I've been able to pursue my passions. I have found an avenue to pursue my passions and to do, some good and help society. So to me, it's not about leadership. It's about doing the right thing. It's about using your God-given skills, to improve the quality of life of society and your neighborhood. And there's a place for all of us to do that. And I don't think, I think one of the biggest problems, and I talk to a lot of kids, a lot of young people in colleges and in high schools, and I tell them, you've got to have attitude. And that attitude is the attitude of believing in yourself and in your worth and that you're capable of giving and fight. And you know what? Yes, you're going to fight. And yes, you're going to suffer setbacks. That's part of life. And you got to work your ass off, okay? There are no freebies.